tackle what we challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And since it's 10 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States on a Monday, it means that it is time for our weekly joint live stream. So, Peter, how are you? How are you feeling?
Better, much better. I had a kind of foggy weekend. Let's put it that way. I had a cold. Okay, I think it was COVID again. But Monday, it's 24 degrees Celsius here. Wearing short sleeves. Windows are open. There's natural light in this room. So what's there not to like?
What's not to like? Well, that's absolutely right. So, I mean, the big news that we need to address is the death of Pope Francis. Not exactly unexpected. He was 88 years old, and he seemed to be, on death's door a number of times, and we've been expecting, well, this is it, but then he seemed to recover, and indeed so much so that he actually delivered an Easter greeting on Easter Sunday and rode around in his
had a meeting with J.D. Vance.
He had a meeting with J.D. Vance, which apparently was quite friendly. He gave 3 Easter eggs for J.D. Vance's children, and then he died. Now, there's a number of interesting aspects of this. First of all, when you read the obituaries in the kind of Western mainstream media, they are entirely focused on his supposed politics. In other words, everything is measured according to, is Pope Francis a New York Times reader? Is it the kind of person who would be, found in an Upper West Side cafe reading the New York Times? And that's the only measure of Pope Francis. So by that measure, yeah, he's pretty good. Yeah, it's good. He has all the right enlightened views. So here's just a couple of excerpts from the New York Times editorial.
Well, it's interesting as you find it. Pope Francis had to pass muster with liberals.
Exactly, that's the only measure.
And you know what? In the scheme of things, that is just like that much of the story. It's almost insignificant.
Exactly, and that's really the essence of the whole thing, is that the people who are writing these obituaries couldn't care less about the Catholic Church. They couldn't care less about the Catholic doctrine. They couldn't care less about the state of the Catholic faith or any of the Catholic dogma or what it means to be
real Christians in the Middle East.
Exactly, none of it. Or does he have the appropriate views on the things that matter to us? And so here's this this obit from the New York Times. Can you see this?
Yep.
It says, his insistence on shaking up the status quo earned him no shortage of enemies. He demoted conservatives in Vatican offices, restricted the use of the old Latin Mass, dear to traditionalists, with that sneer, opened influential meetings of bishops to lay people, including women. Women already make an early appearance, allowed priests to bless same-sex couples, and made clear that transgender people could be godparents and that their children could be baptized. So, well, that's great. And then he also refused to endorse calls to deny communion to Catholic politicians supportive of abortion rights, including when he was President Joseph Biden, who said Francis had called him a good Catholic. But that's just Biden's claim that that's what Francis had said to him. Francis didn't say in public, as far as I know, that he considered Biden to be a good Catholic. And then he said,
"That's this Joe's memory,
Exactly, and this is part of it. Like when he went to see Nelson Mandela and got himself arrested, and so on and so forth,
and Corn Pop and everybody else.
Exactly. Conservative Catholics accused him of diluting church teachings and never stopped rallying against him. Simmering dissent periodically exploded into view in almost medieval fashion. Now,
Medieval. Oh, medieval. Oh my
medieval.
God. Just using the language just shows their mindset. Okay. He
That's
was
right.
our Pope.
That's right.
No,
He's
he
ours,
wasn't.
exactly. One of us. Now, the thing is, what is never clear that every single pope is a subscriber to Vatican II. I mean, they made all these reforms. There hasn't been a single pope who has in any way said, I think we made a huge mistake on Vatican II.
Yeah.
You know, so they've
Yeah.
all, Pope John Paul II, Benedict, all of them, all subscribe to Vatican II. So they keep talking about these all very conservative and traditionalists and so on. None of them has in any way challenged
George,
the Vatican II.
Vatican II caught on in the Vatican, but not with the laity.
That's exactly it, and that's
It's so true.
that's absolutely
Okay,
right. That's
because what we're
absolutely right.
seeing, you know, Christianity is under siege everywhere.
Right.
And I know Chris Hedges thinks that it's omnipotent and that it's hegemonic. I can't understand how
I
he
don't
gets
see
it.
it.
I really
Yeah, I
don't.
don't see it.
I
Yeah.
see it as being besieged.
Right.
Okay,
That's
and
right.
the laity have just moved on. I mean,
Right.
in that article, traditionalists, yeah, that's what people want. They want at least parts of the mass in Latin.
Right.
Why?
Exactly.
Because that's what we are. That's how we identify us. That's what
Exactly.
makes us different.
That's right.
And all of the popes from Vatican II, what they've done, erroneously in my opinion, and I was nominally brought up as Catholic, how to make it easy to be a Catholic.
Right.
Well, that's not what the dogma in the church is all about. It's
Right.
about how difficult it is to live in the world
Yep.
and to believe in and act out the scriptures. But all these popes are just saying, "Oh, you're okay. I'm okay." I mean,
That's
Vatican II is like pop psychology from the 1970s.
That's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. That's the thing. So they all swear by this, even though the problem that supposedly was designed to address by Pope John the 23rd is that, well, hey, the Catholic Church is diminishing, fewer and fewer people are in the pews, so maybe we can get with it and be a little more modern and up to date, and then we're going to have a
let the nuns wear mini skirts. That happened in France. That happened in France.
That's right. That's right. And it didn't work. And all you did was you upset all of the people who actually wanted the Catholic Church to be different. And it is different. I mean, because it has the Latin Mass, and it has this very hierarchical structure with the Pope, the infallible
and an
Pope.
An aesthetic,
Absolutely aesthetic. And then you have the Council of the Cardinals, and you have the conclave, and all of that. It's very, very impressive with its with that rigid hierarchy, and the fact that when they issue their dogma, you have to subscribe to it if you're part of it, and that's the allure of the church. If it's going to be a kind of, well, I like this part and I don't like that part, then what's the point of being a Catholic? You might as well just found your own church.
You said in the very, very beginning, and it's such a tell for me. Hours before Pope Francis died, and God help his soul. Okay, I'm not against it. I was kind of indifferent to his pontificate, to be honest with you.
Me too.
But he gave Easter eggs to Vance's children. Easter eggs have nothing to do with Catholicism.
Nothing.
That's what angers me. He's like, when I was in catechism, let's watch Frosty the Snowman,
Frosty. Mm-hmm.
or what's the reindeer one?
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Yeah.
Well, what does that have to do with the church?
Nothing. Nothing at all.
It has nothing. Oh, they just wanted to compete with daycare. Oh, well,
right,
then you're in the wrong business here. Okay, I mean, what I find really interesting, and this is what Orthodox people talk to me here in Russia, is that to speed it up to this century into this decade, is that the Catholic Church went woke.
Yep,
that's how they see it here.
That's right.
Is that they're the wokies?
Right.
The Bolsheviks tried to annihilate us. The
Right.
Nazis tried to
Right.
annihilate us, and
Yep.
you know what? Who's standing? Who's still standing?
Yeah.
We are. You know
That's right.
why? Because we're really rigid. We don't change much, and it's our
That's
strength.
That's right. That's right. That was a huge blunder, a huge own goal by the Catholic Church, and as a result, it's never really been able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, because now you have all these people quite. Well, I don't really agree with the Pope's teaching on this, but I'm still a Catholic. Well, how you can't do that? I mean, if you're going to be a Catholic, you have to accept the teaching, but that's a result of Vatican II, that apparently everybody within the church can start disputing the doctrine, and it just made no sense. And so, there was always been a lot of expectation that, well, finally there'll be a pope who's going to overturn Vatican II. But Pope John Paul II. A lot of people expected that Pope John Paul II would overturn Vatican. He didn't do any of that. And in fact, he went after those traditionalists, who
Well, yeah,
did the Latin Mass. He went after them. He purged
yeah.
them.
But see, the problem. You see, when John Paul II Wojtyła, when he became Pope, and George is absolutely right, because I remember it very well, and I was living in Poland shortly after he um, became the Bishop of Rome. But he was fighting liberation theology, and this is like this is indelibly stamped on the current church,
Right.
because in Latin America you had liberation theology, and this is something that it's been talked about for well over a century. Is that why communism and communist revolutionaries would reject Catholicism? Because they're natural partners. They really are.
Yes.
And they would be very potent. Okay.
Yes.
Having a class, using Christianity in a class analysis, that's a pretty powerful punch. And Wojtyła knew it.
Yes.
And Francis, he was when he was a bishop, he was shutting it down.
Right.
And it's a lot of people are really kind of surprised that Ratzinger made him, because essentially Ratzinger opened the door for him.
Right.
And
Right.
he, Francis, he didn't have a pretty good reputation back home, because he put down the workers. He put workers down.
Yes.
Okay. And so what happened is that this liberation theology, that was completely shut out, and they decided, and here was the cardinal mistake. Well, no pun intended, I guess. They went identitarian.
Yes.
They abandoned a very. I'm not saying the Catholic Church needed to be communist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there is a confluence of interests.
Right.
Okay.
That's
I mean,
right.
if you lived in Latin America, and you have these, 5% of the population growing, exporting fruit to the North America, and everyone else is a slave. Yeah, I think I'd be kind of interested in what Karl Marx would say, because,
Right.
You cannot have personal salvation if you don't have existence. You don't have a nominal existence in this world. How can you be virtuous? Okay. And so Wojtyła shut that off.
Right.
And then ever since then, it's your identity and how you feel about yourself. Well, Catholicism isn't asking you how you feel about yourself. Catholicism is demanding, how are you procuring your salvation? I mean, it's all written down here.
Right. But speaking of Wojtyła, and this is kind of an interesting issue, because the extent of Wojtyła's politics was really quite extraordinary, and hasn't been fully examined. For instance, he was, and you've pointed this out before, but he was very much involved in Solidarity in Poland.
Yep.
And not only that, it was actually involved with the CIA. And then here, can you see this?
Yep.
So this was an article. I mean, this is one of the very few articles that actually traces.
What is the year of this? Do you know?
This article was in 1992.
I read it. I remember.
Yes, me too, but I forgot about it because it's obviously so long ago.
I remember this article.
Carl Bernstein, who used to do some quite good work, and I don't mean the rubbish he did with Woodward, but he did do some interesting work. The article he wrote in the 70s about the CIA and journalists, a very long article, but it's a priceless piece. So here was as the Holy Alliance, Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, and He says here, until Solidarity's legal status was restored in 1989, it flourished underground, supplied, nurtured, and advised largely by the network established under the auspices of Reagan and John Paul II.
I was part of that.
Yes. Tons of equipment, fax
Yep.
machines, printing presses, transmitters, telephones, shortwave radios, video cameras, photocopiers, telex machines, computers, word processors were smuggled into Poland via channels established by priests and American agents and
So if you needed
representatives.
any of those things, you need just go to your local Catholic church.
Right, right, that's right. And then the money for the band union came from CIA funds, the NED, secret accounts of the Vatican, and Western trade unions. Lech Walesa and other leaders of Solidarity received strategic advice, often conveyed by priests or American or European labor experts working undercover in Poland. That reflected the thinking of the Vatican and the Reagan administration. As the effectiveness of the resistance grew, the stream of information to the West about the internal decisions of the Polish government and the contents of Warsaw's communications with Moscow became a flood. The details came not only from priests, but also from spies within the Polish government or who were working for the CIA. According to aides who shared their leaders' view of the world, Reagan and John Paul II refused to accept the fundamental political fact of their lifetimes, the division of Europe as mandated at Yalta and the communist dominance of Eastern Europe. And in a free non-communist Poland, they were convinced would be a dagger to the heart of the Soviet Empire. And then it
Kind
says,
of an echo to the present here, isn't it?
that's right. According to Solidarity leaders, Walesa and his lieutenants were aware that both Reagan and John Paul II were committed to Solidarity's survival, but they could only guess at the extent of the collaboration. Officially, I didn't know the church was working with the US. This says Wojciech Ademiecki, the organizer and editor of underground Solidarity newspapers, and now counselor at the Polish embassy in Washington. We were told the Pope had warned the Soviets that if they entered Poland, he would fly to Poland and stay with the Polish people. The church was of primary assistance. It was half open, half secret, open as far as humanitarian aid, and secret as far as supporting political activities. And then says the Pope himself, not only his deputies, met with American officials to assess events in Poland and the effectiveness of American actions and sent back messages, sometimes by letter, sometimes orally, to Reagan. On almost all of his trips to Europe and the Middle East, Casey, that's Bill Casey, the former CIA director, flew first to Rome so that he could meet with John Paul II and exchange information. But the principal emissary between Washington and Rome remained Walters, that's Vernon Walters, the former deputy director of the CIA, who worked easily with Casey. Walters met with the Pope perhaps a dozen times, according to Vatican sources. Walters was sent to and from the Vatican for the specific purpose of carrying messages between the Pope and the President. It wasn't supposed to be known that Walters was there. It wasn't all specifically geared to Poland. Sometimes there were also discussions about Central America or the hostages in Lebanon. So Wojtyla was an extraordinarily political person. This article has been largely forgotten. We're still, this wonderful story about solidarity, the spontaneous movement of the Polish people, but the extent of external involvement, the CIA, the Reagan administration, and above all, the Vatican, very actively involved, kind of puts a very different spin on what really happened in Poland in the 1980s.
And throw in Radio Free Europe, which was very, very active in
That's right.
smuggling in things and whatnot.
No.
Yeah, that was my lived experience. I remember it very clearly. The samizdat, there was it was everywhere. I mean,
Right.
it was so ubiquitous that people read it in public. I mean,
Right.
and the authorities knew it. Okay, but yeah, I mean, it's really complicated because yes, there was covert operations. The U.S. was doing everything in its power to weaken the Soviet bloc. That was the Cold War. Okay, fine. But what was interesting for me is that when it all came to an end, when the roundtable discussions in 1989 and then the end of communist rule, it's very interesting. And this will be a topic for another podcast because it's quite long, how the solidarity movement, because it won. So the CIA and Ned, they packed their bags. Like, we got other things to do. The solidarity movement turned in on itself, and it's still fighting itself to this day. Okay. But yes, it was mission accomplished. And Wojtyła was, I saw the Pope twice in Poland. Very, national identity. This is what it was for a lot of people. And you have to understand, too, the country was essentially in a depression economically. So
Right.
Polish society was very open to this. I mean, for goodness sake, it was the first non-Italian pope in 500 years or something like that. So,
Right.
Very important.
But of course, but that in itself was a very interesting thing that happened, because what Poland, they started borrowing and borrowing and borrowing in the 1970s, because now
Right.
the banks, the Western banks, were chock full of the
The Soviets said, "You really think you should be doing this?" Huh?
that's right, the petrodollars, and I remember, and there was Edward Gierek, and of course was they were borrowing and borrowing, and of course, then you're always going to have a lot of problems. You do have a lot of economic expansion.
Well,
I
no,
mean,
you
money to play with,
borrowed
you do have economic
dollars.
Yeah,
You took dollars, and
Right.
when your currency collapses, you know what that means? You're paying a lot more for that dollar that you borrowed.
well, you do, because and then of course what happened is what happened in Poland, similar to what happened in Yugoslavia, or Argentina, Mexico, is that when the U.S. government basically to crush inflation started raising interest rates, that of course elevated the value of the dollar, and suddenly they had no means at all of paying this money back. Now, of course, everyone knows this. Everyone knows that this is what's going to happen if you keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Essentially, you are going to become a slave of the creditor, because the creditor is going to come in and say, "I want the money back," and you have no means of getting it back, and that of course created the problems for Poland, because they had this solidarity movement. They thought, well, we'll just keep this down, but they had to find some means of paying the money back. And the irony of it is that when Jaruzelski imposed martial law, this was not an unpopular move in the West, particularly among the German bankers, because he said, "Yeah, you got to do something. You got to get. We need this money back, otherwise we're going to go under."
Well, another part of that story is that all of the Soviet help to keep the Polish economy afloat, the canned goods and all kinds of things. Okay, and which of course was never recognized. Okay, and the Soviets were getting fed up with it. Okay, because you borrow dollars and now we have to. It's a tax. You borrow dollars and we are taxing us. It's an indirect tax on us.
Right. That's right. So what happened in Poland? Very similar to what happened in Mexico. Mexico, of course, actually defaulted. Mexico just said we can't pay it. They just just flat out defaulted. Similar to what happened in Argentina, but it happened in Yugoslavia, and the Yugoslavia also borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, and then when he couldn't pay it back, they had to call in the IMF, and then the IMF, imposed its familiar policies. And this is again where Wojtyła makes a very, very, I think, a very sinister intervention, because he was one of the people actively encouraging the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Now, at the time, if it was, because he's a Catholic, and he likes Croatia and Slovenia. But there's a little more to it than that, because after all, there was a link between the Vatican and the Ustasha state of World War II. So much so that a lot of those Ustasha leaders escaped. They would have been, without question, executed in 1945, but they escaped thanks to the Catholic Church. Ante Pavelic, the leader of the Ustasha Croatia, he went to Argentina, then he went to Francoist Spain. But how did he get to Argentina? He got there thanks to the rat lines, the Catholic Church's rat lines. But here's an article about Wojtyła's role in Yugoslavia, which is quite interesting. Also, largely ignored, largely forgotten. Um, here's this article. Blessing the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Vatican's role in EC policymaking. And then it says this Mario Nobilo, the chief foreign policy advisor to President Tudjman, he was the Croatian president, analyzed the Vatican's behavior and pointed out that it was actually the Vatican that used the Catholic Church in Germany to influence the German government to recognize Slovenia and Croatia. In fact, the communication between Germany and the Vatican continued as Genscher, that's Hans-Dietrich Genscher, foreign minister at the time, paid another visit to the Holy See on the 24th of December 1991. His visit was important as it managed to overturn what Genscher himself initially argued to be the Vatican's position vis-a-vis Yugoslav crisis and its settlement. The day after his visit, the German government decided to recognize the two republics. Then it says, in Nobila's view, Pope John Paul II supported the disintegration of Yugoslavia. In fact, during his tour in Poland and Hungary in August 1991, he openly assured Croatian believers about the Vatican's awareness of Croatian aspirations and his intention to call the international community to assist the Croats. And then Gras Conchila headlined the visit as the Pope calls on the international community to help Croatia. In fact, the Pope's standpoint was not something new, but rather the continuation of an approach the Vatican had adopted during the whole enigma surrounding the position of the Catholic clergy in Tito's Yugoslavia. Now, his willingness to assist the end of the SFRY was appreciated among the Vatican's diplomatic representations around the world. And then, as one author noted, correspondence between the Vatican and other states never ignored the fact that Slovenia and Croatia were Catholic republics in the Yugoslav Federation and thus deserved proper support. And then, by late winter,
then the Civil War started.
Exactly. This is absolutely, reckless, beyond reckless, because John Paul II knew exactly what was going to happen. He knew perfectly well that this would.
Well, and plus, George, he knew exactly what was going to happen, but the Vatican couldn't do it itself. I mean, the Vatican, a papal bull. Okay, well, that's what the Vatican says. But when Germany says it,
right.
Then it's a different story.
That's right. But I think that's why it's important that he had the influence. He had, with the Germans, and so the Pope supported. And in fact, the Pope is encouraging this. He's actually pressing the German government. Now, Germans were going to do it anyway. But to have the Catholic Church leaning on the German government, well, you really have to recognize Croatia and Slovenia. So remember, what John Paul II here was doing, since we are talking about the Catholic Church, he was going against what the United Nations Secretary General at the time, Pérez de Cuellar, was urging. He was going against what Lord Carrington and Cyrus Vance was saying. Look, if you recognize Croatia and Slovenia, this place is going to explode. There's just going to be a civil war, and particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They said that's where it's going to explode. Wojtyla, nonetheless, went ahead with this. I mean, I'm saying this because I'm sick to death of this sanctification of Wojtyla. I mean, this is a guy, a very, very political person. Didn't do much about going back to Vatican II, but he was very much involved in the politics.
But see, I'm glad you started out with that obituary because, there's so many different. It's like a prism. You can look at Wojtyla and you can look at the Catholic Church after the Second World War through. There's so many different layers. Wojtyla crushed liberation theology in the Western Hemisphere. He was a willing surrogate, I'm trying to be generous here, of the Western powers to undermine the Soviet sphere of influence. On that kind of one, fair's fair. Okay, I mean, I can be agnostic about that. It was the Cold War. Okay,
right.
But the Catholic Church is supposed to stand for other things, apparently, and it gets worse after Wojtyla. I have to, I don't talk much about my personal religious beliefs very much, but I just kind of drifted away from the Catholic Church because the church drifted away from
Right.
me. What they talked about were issues that I don't know why they're talking
Right.
about it. It has nothing
Right.
to do. It's kind of like, when people talk about, Islam was oppressive because of
Right.
the burqa. And I just point out, I said, Islam doesn't speak about the burqa. It has nothing to do with the burqa.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Right.
And so when, these people that are these kind of religious postmodernist people, they look at this institution and they grab what they want
Right.
and impugn
Right.
meaning to it. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of Catholics have just said bye, and
Right.
they have their own communities. Even when living in Southern California many years ago, people would say, "Yeah, that's a traditional Catholic. They have the Mass in Latin."
Right.
I mean, and the diocese, they were just like doing everything they can to go after those people,
Right.
go after the priest, and threatening them and all of that. And it was just the laity was saying, but no, this is what we want.
Right.
Because
Right.
Vatican II said, oh, it's oppressive to the people.
Right.
No, it was beautiful for people.
Right. Right. No, that's right. So, but the question, I mean, that's a very interesting. I mean, you said, okay, that's fair, in terms of Poland, and that may well be right. I mean, that okay. I mean, he had an agenda. He didn't like communism. Most Poles didn't like communism. He wanted basically, get rid of the communists. He wanted people to, attend Catholic mass, and wanted like the restoration of a Catholic Poland. So that's fair. The question then is whether the way it was done really was, did it really serve any good ends?
Well,
You would have to
one
say,
thing
I
it
mean,
did serve.
the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, I think, was, I don't think it did serve, wholly good ends. Communism was clearly failing in Eastern Europe. The collapse, a very abrupt collapse, I think, did not serve any good ends.
Oh, absolutely. Um, uh, you know, we're talking about how the Catholic Church, Wojtyła, they were all a conduit of Western influence to
Right.
undermine the Soviet orbit. But the flip side of that, everybody, is the power of the Catholic Church in Poland. And
Right.
in my personal experience, I was a lecturer at the Catholic University in Lublin. I found the Catholic Church to be overwhelmingly oppressive.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
really, not from ethics. It's just they were hypocrites. A lot of them were simply hypocrites. Okay,
Mm.
I mean the aid that was coming from the West, the way it was divvied up and who was favored and who wasn't, it was very unchristian in my point of view. Okay,
Right.
and and almost the entire time I lived there for way over 10 years, and I didn't like the clergy. I didn't like
Right.
the clergy at all. Okay,
Right.
I'm going to keep my language clean here, but
Right.
they weren't a good cadre, in my
Right.
opinion. Okay, and
Right.
what I'm trying to take some parts from what George is saying there. Is that um, did it serve a good purpose? I think that's the jury still may be out. But if you look in the case of Poland, was communism really defeated? Well, the ideology wasn't, but not the people that were the communists, because they captured the state. They
Right.
captured the
Right.
enterprises, the factories.
Right.
Okay, I mean, the longer we talk about it, the names will start flowing back into my memory. But invoking God in the classroom. Yes, we can do that. Yes, yes. Okay.
Right.
Have the Pilsudski statues. Yes, we can have all that. And then you realize, oh, you just gave the store to people that no longer call themselves communists, and now they're little mini oligarchs in Poland,
Right.
and they still are. Okay,
Right. Right.
and that is one of the reasons why Solidarity started collapsing in on itself, because there was strands of ethno supremacy, anti-Semitism, all kinds of stuff that was under the big flag of Solidarity. And then once the struggle was over, they started fighting each other, and they realized that the workers' movement was completely sold out. It was completely sold out. Okay,
Right.
where did it all start? In Gdansk and Gdynia, in the shipyards. Well, Where are they? They're gone. They
Right.
failed.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Right.
Where is the worker state in Poland? No, you have the same kind of hierarchies and oligarchies that have been just transferred from Brussels to Poland. Okay.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a Pyrrhic victory in many ways if you judge it by the goals of the time. Okay. It ended up being very, very different. Yeah, the communists are gone, but the people that were a lot of them are dead now. But a lot of people that were backing the regime, well, they ended up living very, very comfortable lives.
Right.
Okay, and a lot of Poles are very resentful about that. And the reason why I bring up the point, the church is still in control of a lot of things.
Right. That's right. Well, I think the Polish government the policies it pursued in borrowing these huge amounts of money and essentially letting this economy rip. Now, what happens when you have basically people getting quite prosperous very quickly? Well, they're going to start demanding things. That's it's always when you have the worst moment for any regime is when expectations are rising, because that's when it becomes very hard to suppress expectations. They think, hey, we're doing very well. This is just really go Poland of the 70s, and then of course, because were getting themselves into trouble. The regime, they needed solidarity. They were hoping to get solidarity to bring workers under control. To sort of, hey, just calm down, because we need to pay back this money. So the goal was original. That's why they were so tolerant towards solidarity. So, they allowed them to create this union, and they worked together with solidarity because they wanted to, get the workers to help out the regime. Now, the problem in Poland, the Poles, is they're not very cooperative. They're not very good at it. And that was a failed enterprise. They gave solidarity. They recognized a non-state trade union. They'd never done that before. They recognized it, and of course they said, "Nah, that's not enough for us. We actually want to run the whole place." And that of course.
Well. Not run the whole place. Wreck it first.
Wreck it first. That's right.
Wreck it first.
Right.
Okay.
But then the Soviets really they really kind of had a hands-off policy. I mean, it could have. It should have been obvious to them this is going to end badly. I mean, what was going on in Poland in the 70s, but they just let things go. They let things drift, and that pervaded. But I guess it's sort of just I find it interesting that the Catholic Church, particularly Wojtyla, played such an active role in it. And in a way, this was really the goal. The goal. Why did they elect Wojtyla to be Pope? This was 78, 79. I think it was 1978. I think it was
78 too.
Yeah,
because he made his first visit in 79, and
right.
then 1980 was Solidarność.
That's right. This was always that was the plan.
I've come across this before. I mean, those kind of coincidences are hard to swallow, but it still can be. Okay, it still can be. Okay,
right.
But certainly he was a young man. He was very charismatic. I mean, I can remember watching. Okay, so I go to Poland in 1981. Okay, the first time during martial law, and so when his first visit in 79, so that's 24 months, something like that. So it's fresh in everyone's memory. But the number of people that said when Wojtyła went to Krakow the first time, or I think it was Krakow, or the city right next to him, I'm trying to remember. He said, "Don't be afraid, I'm here," and that's very powerful. It's very powerful because George has been whacking away at the crumbling of the economy, and then you have a guy come in and say, "I'm here. Everything's going to be good." Okay. And that was certainly an impetus. I'm not denying the religious identity. I'm not using religiosity here, okay? Because there's a big difference between the two. If you're a Pole, you identify as a Catholic, like 99% of the time, especially as a result of the Second World War, okay?
Right.
I mean, it's more identity and plus the look, I mean, I in the early years there, I mean, there would Poland didn't do a good job in post-war construction. It was a pretty shabby place. Okay, I
Right.
mean, really shabby. I mean, Warsaw was probably at the time the ugliest capital city in Europe by a long shot. By a
Right.
long shot. Okay, and Krakow, the Soviets went around it. They didn't fight for it. Okay, the Germans thankfully left. Okay, so it was preserved, but it was falling apart. I mean, like
Right.
literally into dust.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
but look, everybody. I mean, I was a lot younger then. Obviously, it had its charm. I came from suburbia America, and it ended up in Poland in
Right.
1981. I still think it's a miracle all by itself. Okay,
Right.
I could have easily gone to Spain that year. I could have gone to the UK that year. I
Right.
just ended up in Poland,
Right.
and it changed my life forever. Obviously,
Yeah. Yeah. The that's right. Um, but I guess it's you have to look at the obviously the politics in this, the very active involvement of Wojtyla, which again is still, I mean, he's still the Pope. He's supposed to be attending spiritual matters, but he seems to be awfully involved here with Bill Casey and Vernon Walters and those figures from that time. You know, seems to be very actively meeting them. So he was obviously very, very political. But even if you say, okay, well, he does that, it's hard to justify what he did on Yugoslavia. That seems to me a much
I
more dubious because,
well, I
um,
mean, don't you think to take a physician's oath, do no harm.
yeah,
I mean, okay, again, I'm going to put to the side the Cold War. Okay, it's kind of fair game the way I look at it. Okay, but after the Cold War, and basically being the catalyst to a civil war that has not ended to this
that's right.
day. Well, that was
Exactly.
harm. That's harm, George.
They're very harmful because you really when you think of it, that he as the Pope had warnings, clear warnings from figures who were very actively involved in Yugoslavia, the UN Secretary General, Lord Carrington, Cyrus Vance, who said, don't do anything reckless and unilateral. Don't go ahead and recognize these secessionist republics because it's just going to explode. And he used his status, his standing, his enormous reputation. He was a huge reputation at that time to urge the recognition for Croatia and Slovenia. And really, and particularly obnoxious was it with Croatia, because if it were just a matter of, oh well, this is just Catholic, what do you expect? It's Catholic, but first of all, Croatia and Slovenia were really the only Catholic republics of Yugoslavia. So he identifies that, but particularly Croatia, and particularly given the link between Croatia and the Roman Catholic Church, and for him to just simply ignore all of that, just to go ahead and just urge the recognition of Croatia, given this very sordid history, much of which had incidentally been covered up. I mean, there's a lot of
Oh yeah.
Tito had covered a lot of this stuff up because he didn't want a lot of aggravation and settling of scores after the end of the war. So everything was really what happened in
Which
Croatia was
eventually
covered up.
happened. Which
Yeah,
eventually happened.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, you said you can look at the Croatian German Catholic, but then you have to throw in the Nazis too,
Right. Right.
obviously.
That's
Okay,
right.
I mean, the Catholic Church did not acquit itself well during the Second World War. I'm
No,
sorry.
it certainly did not.
I mean,
Yeah.
there were priests and there were dioceses that rescued people, no doubt about it,
Right.
and very noble.
Right.
But in toto,
No, I don't think
acquitted
so.
itself bad.
And there's a real problem, but a particular problem with Croatia, which is, all right, there were collaborationist governments in Europe. And it's one thing to be a collaborationist. It's quite another thing to be a partner in Nazi crimes, and an enthusiastic, zealous, eager partner in the way Croatia was. I mean, yes, there was a collaborationist regime in Belgrade, but that was just collaborationists. They just simply, hey, somebody's got to run the place. We've been defeated. The Nazis are here, so somebody's got to run it. I mean, didn't do them any good. I mean, they were still executed at the
Yeah,
end of the
it was
war.
kind of a glorified night watchman job. Yeah.
That's right. You've got to do it. It's just the same with Marshal Pétain and Pierre Laval in France. Pétain survived because he had this big reputation, a great general from World War One. Laval did not survive. He was executed after the war. But it's still just a collaboration, is rather than an active participant. So, like, same with Oun in Ukraine. I mean, you're actually actively involved in the Nazi crimes. You're not just simply a collaborator. So, I mean, but that's why,
Yeah, but
particularly, Croatia is obnoxious.
this is kind of a sore point with me. Sorry, George, but they're still collaborating, just using NATO as a vehicle.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, I mentioned this yesterday. I'll be real short. This boycott of the 80th anniversary of victory over fascism that'll be commemorated in Moscow on May 9th. So the Croats and the Slovenians, and all these other countries that were collaborators. Well, they're part of the coalition of collaborators. Okay. You don't want to come? Good. We don't want you here. Okay. Because this is the coalition of the winners that'll be showing up in Moscow.
Right.
It's a very sore point with me. I mean, I was out in a cafe yesterday, beautiful weather and posh place, and there was a guy doing a stencil on the window of the cafe, and it was commemorating Pride, 1945 to 2025. And it's all over the city, okay? And it does create a sense of pride, particularly since the coalition that was organized in the mid-1940s it's back in business.
It's back in business. Yeah, that's right. But
it's looked upon that. Every country in a military conflict has soft power. Okay, they want. They're going to push a message. They have their talking point. Everybody does it, and it happens here. But you don't have to push Victory Day on anyone in Russia. You don't. You don't have to push it on anyone because it's a people's celebration. It's not a state celebration. And this is what's so misunderstood in the West, is that if the state didn't put a dime into commemoration, the people would do it themselves.
Right.
They don't need coordination. They don't need direction. People are going to do it themselves.
Yeah. It's a very creepy attitude that the Europeans are adopting, because what they could say, Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen, they could say, well, look, whatever you want to do. If you go, we would advise you not to, but if you need to do it, then do it. Instead, by threatening, saying that if you go on May the 9th, we're going to take measures against you. Now, remember, the people who are going, they are going not because they like Russia or Putin or anything like that. They're going to say thank you for what you did 80 years ago. That's why they're going. When Robert Fico says I'm going, he's saying because Czechoslovakia was liberated by the Red Army. When Milorad Dodik and Vučić say that we're going, they say because the Red Army liberated Yugoslavia. So we're saying thank you for that. And so essentially what Kaja Kallas and the rest of them say, well, no, you're not allowed to say thank you. You're supposed to regard the Russians as your enemies. So the people who had liberated you as your enemies. And this is where it gets very, very creepy. And then it goes back to that strange tweet, maybe not so strange, sent out by George Soros, when he was saying, oh, yeah, I remember being in Hungary in 1945, and, this is how we felt, when the Red Army was closing in, we sort of, regard, that's how the Ukrainians must feel now, the way the way we were feeling in besieged Budapest with the Red Army closing in.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be more pedantic than we usually are, and this is not a trick question. I'm not trying to make you look bad, but do you know how many Red Army soldiers died liberating Hungary?
That was a huge number. Yeah.
600,000 Red Army. I'm not saying Russians. I'm not saying Ukrainians or Georgians or whatever. It was the Red Army. Right. 600,000 gave their lives for Hungary
Right.
to throw off the scourge of fascism.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so when
Yes.
Hungarians complain to me, I'm sorry. Okay,
Right.
I don't have any crocodile tears for you.
No, definitely not. And of course, the particular problem with in Hungary's case, and I mean, I don't really want to pick on Hungary because Hungary is actually one of the better countries in Europe today. I mean, I think it's pursuing a kind of, at least under Orban. I don't know what would happen, the guy who comes after him, but under Orban, he's been pursuing a fairly rational, reasonable policy. But the problem with Hungary was that not only was it on the losing side, it had actually taken part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. It had fought at Stalingrad. I mean, it got decimated at Stalingrad. It was a terrible death. They suffered huge casualties. I was kind of forgotten how many casualties the Hungarians suffered, but it was at Stalingrad
Right next door was Romanians. Okay.
that Romania, yeah. So when that happens, you're going to pay a price. You're on the losing side. You invaded a country. Now it's payback time, and so to go on and complaining about the Soviets and the Russians and all this terrible. Yeah, all right. Communism was no picnic, but you were gonna pay a price. You had to accept that you were going to pay a price for having done it. Hungary didn't really have to invade the Soviet Union. I mean, Hungary volunteered to do it. I mean, it's not like Hitler said, "We need you. You've got to join us." They volunteered
Yeah.
to do this. so, so they paid a price. But as it happens, Hungary really did quite well because they got a reasonable regime of Kadar, who basically let the Hungarians alone. Just so long as you don't give us headaches, you can do whatever you want. So these complaints, I always find just really.
I mean, I'm glad you bring it up. I mean, I have no interest in picking on Hungary or any other country,
Right.
actually, because if you take the historical approaches, it's all linear. Yep, that was a certain time, and George is right.
Right.
Crime and punishment. There was a price to
Right.
pay, but we move on. Okay, and so
Right.
it's instrumentalizing something. Okay,
Right.
and which I
Right.
just think is what the European leadership should do is just the opposite. They should come.
Right.
And they should come to Moscow,
Right.
and they should all sit around and say, "Well, we're all really on the shit right now." Okay, I mean,
Right.
but 1945 has different meanings for different people, but
Right.
we can create dialogue through that and not just
Right.
furor. Okay, but I mean, it's for me, it's just what they're doing is so counterproductive. I mean, can we all
Right.
agree? Let's all take a
Yeah.
breath right now.
Right.
Let's all take a breath. Is it good that fascism was defeated in Europe in May
Right.
1940? Can we all agree on that?
Right. But that's a
Okay, well,
very,
that's the starting
yeah.
point. That's the starting point, huh?
But that's a very interesting question because, of course, they don't agree with that. And that's ultimately, yeah, it was okay when the British and the Americans came. It's not okay when the Red Army came. So they don't agree with that. They don't agree that somehow this was an improvement, and that just seems to be the height of absolute outrageous insolence because they say, oh, we basically exchanged one oppressor for another. Well, there's really no comparison. You survived. You got
Yeah, well, I mean,
communism's
George,
no picnic. You survived under communism.
um, after in September 1939 to the end of the war, where was Poland?
Exactly. Yeah.
There was no Poland.
Right.
It was a occupied zone without
Right.
a name. Okay,
Right.
Governor General.
Right.
That's what. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. The government general. Yeah. That's right. Um, so that's why you're going to say, look, you didn't have any choice in the matter. Basically, Father Christmas wasn't coming. There was no Father Christmas wasn't going to come and liberate you. It was only going to be the Red Army. And I think this is really the problem, like the Hungarians who somehow thought that, oh well, maybe the Americans will reach Budapest before the Red Army. Well, there was a problem about that, which is that the Americans were stuck in Italy. I mean, the Germans proved to be, as always, very tenacious fighters. They were making very little progress in Italy. They never made it to Hungary.
Well, in this case, Hungary, if you want to blame somebody, blame Churchill. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So sorry, I mean, it wasn't going to happen.
It's so interesting, when you look at Allied decision making during the war, the further you get away from it, it's just like, well, why Italy? and you can throw into that, why the Philippines?
Yes.
What was the purpose of liberating the Philippines when Nimitz had a brilliant military strategist, absolutely brilliant, okay?
Right.
I mean, what he did at Midway, that puts him on the pantheon of great military leaders. I mean, for goodness sake. I mean, the tenacity he had.
Right.
And, George, you have to make a decision, and it's like a 20-minute window.
Right.
You send them out too soon, you send them out too late. The planes are never going to find those aircraft carriers. And he calmly said, go. Okay.
That's right.
All right. MacArthur, I think, is one of the biggest frauds in military history, in my opinion. Okay. I shall return. I don't know how many American troops died liberating the Philippines for no reason. Okay. And the same thing applies. I mean, if you go talk to American veterans and their stories about the Second World War, the vast majority of them about fighting in Italy. Right. And it's not in France. No, it's Italy. Because the Germans, because of the geography, it was just like, you got to hop and hop and hop. Oh,
that's right. And they made very little progress. Basically, northern Italy just remained under German occupation. The Americans made very little progress in Italy. So it was quite pointless. But, the Hungarians believe somehow, 43, 44, that somehow the Americans are going to reach and we will be liberated by the Americans. It never happened. But that's unfortunately the case, that somehow these kinds of beliefs that these countries have, that we could have had this wonderful liberation if only it hadn't been for the Red Army. Well, there was no one else. There was no one. It was, one country after another was liberated by the Red Army. The Americans were nowhere near. They weren't anything, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all of them. The Americans and the British were nowhere near them.
But why would the British and the Americans want to really liberate Budapest? I mean, Franklin Roosevelt said, the defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies, and we're out of here.
Right.
Okay,
right.
If you defeat them in northern France and they collapse, then good, fine, we're done. Okay,
right.
I mean, it's all what if this or that happened. Well, that's what you do. That's what you do with beer in a bar. Okay.
That's right. It's redundant, but the people like Soros kind of, he was in Hungary through the war. It was lived through the war, and when he said, "Yeah, this is how we saw it," he has never said, "Well, I think I was wrong." He said, "No, I mean, we were very reasonable in believing in Budapest in 1945 that we didn't want the Red Army." So you still adhere to that view that somehow.
Why, George Soros? Because
the fascists were then in control of Hungary. The Nazis were in control, and the Germans. They were fighting ferociously for Budapest against the Red Army, and Soros still identifies with them.
Well, maybe for the reasons that you already explained to us, George, is that you invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. You didn't have to, okay? Yeah. And now you had to pay a price for it, okay? In total, Hungary, if you look at the
ledger, they didn't do badly. They did not do badly.
War, who wins, who loses in a war. When when you get at the commanding heights and all of that, that's easy to talk about. But in wars, the average people lose all the time. 99% of the time, they're the losers. Okay, we can have our grand narratives and political histories and all of that. But I would travel through Eastern Europe in the 1980s. That was, like 35 years after the war. And you
Right.
could still see
Right.
the massive impact on it.
Yes.
Massive.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And I mean, when we talk about Hungary in 1956, which was a very traumatic for the Hungarians, um, but I think a lot of Hungarians don't realize it, including Orban himself. They don't realize it, that there was just no way the Soviets, 10 years after the war, were going to let Hungary go and said, okay, well, fine, you go off, join NATO, at NATO, 1956. This was a NATO in which West Germany was already a member. And there was no question, of course, the Hungarians. I mean, Imre Nagy had already announced he's withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. The next step is we're going to join NATO. I mean, this is, who can doubt that the next step would be joining NATO? There was no way the Soviets were going to put up with it. And somehow, Orban and the rest of them just will not
Yeah,
accept
but I mean,
that there's just this could not happen.
you can have all your national narratives you want. I don't deny it. I mean, I can remember in the 1990s and the early 2000s, I would talk to people from the Baltic republics, and I'd say you're perfectly. It's perfectly reasonable that you have the opinions that you have. I don't agree with them, but
Right.
this is what national histories do to you.
Right.
But I mean, the Soviet Union has national history. And a coalition of Western countries invaded Russia for the second time in that century,
right.
and
That's
Russia was going to take its winnings. It
That's
wasn't going to leave anything on the table. It was going to take all of its winnings. I'm sorry, up until 19, we have this kind of rules-based order and sphere. We don't believe in spheres of influence. That's all garbage, because
Right.
there's always spheres of influence.
Right.
They even exist today. Okay,
That's right.
you can't run the world. You can't. You shouldn't conceive of the world through memes.
That's
Okay,
right.
the good
That's
guys
right.
win.
That's right.
Maybe.
That's very true. And one has to always, that's right. And one has to always look at it another way, which is, the Soviets were actually very, very reasonable. They could have taken the whole of Poland. They say we're going to take the whole damn thing. We'll just incorporate it within the Soviet Union. One of the republics of the Soviet Union.
There were members of the Moscow-aligned communist parties, because you have to remember, the Poles had a bad experience in the late 30s in Moscow. Stalin sniffed something and he massacred them. But if you had, because of the Comintern, which was dissolved during the Second World War, remember that? Okay. But there were members, there were Bulgarians, Romanians, Slovenians, the whole lot.
Right.
They were in Moscow waiting. And they begged Stalin, bring us into the Soviet Union. We want to be republics of the Soviet Union. And he said, no.
Yeah. That's right. And same with Finland. He could have taken Finland. Okay, we're going to take it out. Finland had been a part of the Russian Empire. Poland had been a part of the Russian Empire. Yeah, we're going to just take it. I mean, and he didn't do it. So you have to say that it could have been worse. And you think, that really was, the Soviets were actually not unreasonable. Now, the communism that they imposed, that Stalinist communism, was really not nice at all, quite nasty. However, there is another aspect of it, which is that the Cold War started almost immediately, and because it started almost immediately, then that had the predictable effect of a crackdown within the Soviet bloc, because then it was, hey, we got the enemy of Trotskyism, Zionism, American imperialism, and the lot. So this was the exact consequence of the Cold War, and it led to even greater repression in Eastern Europe than might have been the case.
Well, and also, I mean, this is something that nationalists in Eastern Europe don't want to recognize, is that the Soviet Union spent a pretty penny on reconstruction.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it wasn't the best. I mean, Katowice, the steelworks in Poland, that's Soviet built. Okay. Yeah. And so quite a bit was spent. Also, for the most part, there was variations from country to country, but the Soviet troops stayed in their barracks.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't walking around. They stayed in there. I mean, I think it was Zielona Góra in Poland. It was a big base,
Right.
but in the entire time, particularly in the 80s when I lived there, I think I saw a Soviet troop, a
Right.
soldier twice.
That's right.
Twice.
Yeah.
Okay, you
Yeah.
just didn't see them. They were, and they. I think they basically felt, they weren't welcomed. And of course, if you're a soldier, you're just sent somewhere. You're not. I want to go to Poland. I mean, you go where you're told to go, and they stayed on their base, and they were
Right.
not seen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. So there's just one other topic that I wanted to cover briefly. There was in Gaza, a few weeks ago, there were these ambulance people and fire department, or the Palestinian Red Crescent. I mean, these were medics in Gaza. 15 of them, 15 unarmed men, were executed in cold blood, and a report has now been published by the Israeli government. Well, I should say, not only did they bury the bodies, they just simply buried the body, covered up their crimes, but they crushed the vehicles that they had been traveling in, and so here, well, there was the Israeli authorities published a report, and guess what? They absolve themselves of any blame. I mean, not wholly, but they
Mistakes were made. Mistakes
exactly mistake. That's
mistakes
exactly
were
it.
made.
Mistakes were made, and so let me just show this. Yes. So then,
As you're finding it, George, is
yes,
that the initial Israeli report is that these ambulances had no lights
that's right.
on. They
That's
had
right.
not coordinated with the Israeli authorities to be on the
That's right.
move, and
That's right. Right.
actually all of that was a lie.
It was a lie. So here's the IDF announcement. The findings show the incident occurred in a hostile and dangerous combat zone.
Yeah, all of Gaza is.
That's right. The backdrop of the incident is the challenge and the responsibility of the IDF to respect and protect medical teams and facilities carrying out their duties, while also confronting Hamas's repeated use of such infrastructure for terrorism. Now, and then it says the examination found no evidence to support claims of execution or that any of the deceased were bound before or after the shooting. Well, the problem there is that they were all unarmed. And moreover, it was clear that they were traveling in vehicles that were marked UN and essentially that they're medics. So it's hard to see how did you can conclude that this was Hamas. Such claims are blood libels.
Oh,
Excellent.
here we go again.
Exactly. And then says that first incident, and they describe here the approximately the troops fired at a vehicle identified as a Hamas vehicle. Identified as a Hamas vehicle. It wasn't a Hamas
Did
vehicle.
it have Hamas stickers on it, or?
Yeah, we are Hamas. Yes. Um, the second incident, an approximate an hour later, the troops opened fire on suspects emerging from a fire truck and ambulances very close to the area in which the troops were operating. So they emerged from a truck, and then you start shooting at them. I mean that's good. I mean you have no evidence that they're anything other than medics, and you just simply start shooting at them. Um, and then he goes on the third incident, and so on. And so here then it says, at dawn, it was decided to gather and cover the bodies to prevent further harm and clear the vehicles from the route in preparation for civilian evacuation. The body removal and vehicle crushing were carried out by field commanders. The examination concluded that removing the bodies was reasonable under the circumstances, but the decision to crush the vehicles was wrong.
Oh,
In,
not the people, but the vehicle.
that's right. Um, In general, there was no attempt to conceal the event. Well, you did conceal the event. I mean, the only reason we know anything is that there were people coming forward and saying what happened to them. I mean, these medics, weeks have gone by, and we have no news about what happened to these medics. And so it was only because they basically had to send in inspections. The United Nations, they sent in to find out what happened to these medics. And the only reason we know anything is because they found a telephone on one of the dead victims, and he had a recording of the whole thing. So this is the only reason we know about any of this. Otherwise, this would be absolutely hushed up by Israel and said, well, yeah, I mean, that's it. They were just all a bunch of Hamas. So 15 people were killed. No evidence that any of them had any arms. And Israel attempted to conceal this event, but basically the only punishment, I think. Let me just show you what the punishment is, because it's severe. Where are we? This is. And then the examination determined that the fire in the first two incidents resulted from operational misunderstanding by the troops, who believed they faced a tangible threat from enemy forces. But they didn't. And then in its conclusion of the examination process, the chief of the general staff emphasized the commitment to continuing the fight against Hamas while upholding IDF values. This is good. The IDF values: operational discipline and orders. He affirmed that the Golani Reconnaissance Battalion is a professional and high-quality battalion that has been operating with great distinction for a year and a half. And then alongside this, the examination identified several professional failures, breaches of orders, and a failure to fully report the incident. And then
the only reason why they didn't fully report the incident because they got caught.
They got caught. That's got caught. The commanding officer of the 14th Brigade will receive a reprimand. I hate getting a reprimand, which will be recorded in his personal file. Damn. For his overall responsibility for the incident, including the procedure of combat and management. The deputy commander of the Golani Reconnaissance Battalion will be dismissed from his position due to his responsibilities as the field commander. But, and here it goes next, however, the commanders emphasized that the deputy commander, the one who's just been dismissed, is a highly respected officer whose military service and personal story reflect a spirit of combat, volunteerism, and great dedication.
So he's going to be promoted.
Exactly. In other words, not only is he going to promote it, he's going to move on, having been dismissed, into a lucrative position and be deemed a hero of Israel. Unfairly picked on, unfairly targeted, really unfair that he should be dismissed when he should actually be rewarded.
Well, this is something you and I have been observing, is the normalization of a genocide against people. Well, mistakes were made.
Mistakes are made.
That's it. This is, it's nasty business, but it happens sometimes. Okay. What's really interesting is, it's really easy, and we fall into it too. So I'm not going to deny it, but Trump's on the move, so he's covering a lot of ground, and there's a lot of things. I even said this yesterday to you. It's really hard to keep up seriously.
Right.
But it works to the advantage of the IDF, okay, because they can just continue on and on and on. And the story of Gaza is far from over. You and I have talked about this. I'm still convinced that they're going to try to move these people one way or another.
Right.
I just can't see how they can back off. I just can't. Right. And because the Western world is giving them a pass. I mean, if this story doesn't break the camel's back, when it was first reported, I've watched a number of people cover it. your heart is already broken. I mean, it just so it's a morally exhausting. I mean, so you even let this go by. I mean, how many journalists have been killed? How many healthcare workers? How many doctors? How many and how many young boys and girls have a gunshot to their head and chest? I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Okay.
And this is the normalization of it all. And Tammy Bruce, which for God knows how why she was given that job. I saw her initial response to it. It's all about Hamas.
It's all
Hamas.
Hamas. Yeah, yeah. I saw that as well. Yeah, it's Hamas. It's all Hamas. 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 I mean, there's something really truly disgusting about anyone who just does this. You know, you lack any, even the minimal of kind of human, just humanity. Just just somehow. Can you just realize what happened? 15 unarmed people, humanitarian workers. These are medics. 15 humanitarian workers. 15 medics, unarmed, are dead. They were just killed. They were killed
And
for nothing.
in the
So
video,
they were trying to help others.
exactly in the video of one of the victims that they found later, he was apologized to his mother because he was
Yeah,
trying to help people.
that's right. Well, he's the one. He's the one. It was his phone.
Yeah.
That's right. He knew. He knew he was going to be killed.
But see, my whole approach to this is that if you know about this, all of you watching this video, this is it happened. Okay, I mean the IDF and the Israeli government have reacted to it, so there's no denying that it
That's
happened.
right.
Okay, but since you have this knowledge right now, you're in a moral predicament. You have to take a side on this.
Right.
Oh, that it's complicated and it's been going on forever. No, you can't use those arguments. This is
Right.
called premeditated murder. I mean,
Right.
that's what it is.
Yeah.
And you have to decide on that.
Yeah.
You
Right.
have to. You have no choice.
That's right. That's right. It's very interesting that that this is obviously this was a cold-blooded execution. It was obvious Israel attempted to cover up the crime. It was unfortunate for Israel that basically the United Nations got involved and wanted to find out what happened to this convoy of medics. So they went there, and then they found the bodies and they found the crushed vehicles. And then, unfortunately for Israel, there was this damn telephone with a recording. So with all that, basically having lied, given one lie after another, and now it was obviously shown to be a lie. These were clearly marked vehicles. The lights were on. They said, oh, the vehicles weren't marked. They didn't have the lights on. No, the lights were clearly on. The vehicles were marked. So now they just say, well, mistakes were made. And anyway, it's all Hamas's fault. It's all, so whatever we did it because of Hamas. I mean, and they get away with this. They get away with it. The media basically gives them a pump. Well, Hamas, there it is. They're really bad guys. And that,
But you can't use this argument that it's all about Hamas because that's buying into the Israeli narrative. This is not a war against Hamas. Hamas doesn't have artillery, it doesn't have tanks, it doesn't have planes, it doesn't have intel. It has small arms and firecrackers, essentially. Okay? This is a war on a people and a society.
right.
So when a school has been evacuated, there's no one there, and then gleefully just blow it up. Why? Because you want to destroy the infrastructure that can support a population.
Right.
This is a war against a people. It's not against Hamas.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Let's see if we can just look at some of our comments on the Gagglers page, and we have. I was going to look at Iskander Magnos. So thank you very much for your generosity. I really appreciate it. So that was very, very good of you. And the other comments that we have that uh, Hope Some says, do either of you gentlemen have a potential short list of candidates for the papacy? I saw
I saw one too.
yeah, I saw a short list. I don't have the inside track. I don't have the
I,
inside dope as to which one of them
many,
will get
many
it.
many years ago, there was this American. I think he was a priest and also kind of a journalist, and he was. This was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but he was kind of like the America's insider at the Vatican. And I can remember, when we had that slew of popes, and he was given the odds in a very American kind of sports casting approach. I've lost track of that guy a long, long time ago. But I agree with George. I saw just for a second today the list.
Right.
There's
So,
one
some
Italian, there's one Uganda.
yeah, Ghanaian. There's a Ghanaian
Ghanaian.
guy. Yeah, Ghanaian, and then there's a Hungarian as well. So
There's a
I'm
Hungarian,
sure
yeah, and
there's a
two or
Hungarian.
three of them are named Peter.
So the Hungarian, the Hungarians are rooting for that. Um, I don't know. At this stage, I can't say. I would be. I mean, people are expecting that it'll be somebody from the global south. I have my doubts that they're going to do that. That they're really going to select the Ghanaian to be the Pope. Um, so I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest, if it was the Hungarian. I mean, it's
Yeah, but see, because we're rapidly running out of time, and this has been a really good live stream. What if I were to immerse myself again into it, and I don't think I will, to be honest with you, it will be where they stand. Are they going to continue with the Vatican II identitarian project,
right,
or
right,
are they
right,
going to look?
right,
Vatican II. I mean, I'm a critic of Vatican One.
right.
That's how I feel. Okay, George, nice little trivia. I think Vatican One started in 1869.
1870. I think it was 1870.
No,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
It was. They decided to have it in 69. They started it in 1870. And then, European geopolitics blew up. Okay. Then you have the
Right,
Italian state, you have
right,
Prussia on the move, and Germany is
right,
created and all of that.
right,
Do you know when the Catholic Church
right.
officially shut down Vatican One? Officially.
When
1960 to open up Vatican II.
Vatican II. That's right. The Vatican.
Vatican One was
That's
still open.
right.
It's true. The Catholic Church works slowly. Okay.
They were
No,
very, yeah,
I
that's
think
right.
that
Uh,
what I'd be interested in is are they going to read the room? Are they going to read the collective Catholic room? I I tend to doubt it.
I
Yeah.
tend to doubt it as well. I think that if John Paul II and if Pope Benedict, um, didn't overturn Vatican II, didn't even go back in any way on Vatican II, I have my doubts if they're going to do it now. I mean, Benedict, I think, was their last hope.
Hope.
Somehow going back to the traditional mass, of going back
I
on
met him in
essentially.
Poland. I met him. I shook his hand in Poland. Yeah.
You talking about Wojtyla or you talking about Wojtyla?
Benedict.
Oh,
No,
you met Benedict. Oh, I see. I didn't know
right.
you met Benedict. Well, particularly Benedict, because he had been Cardinal Ratzinger, and he had built up this reputation of this real arch conservative, but it really didn't do anything really very much there. Let's see if there's anything else we can look at. Then here we have Babs Habits. Nice to see you again. Says that where are we? Yeah, Babs Habit says, as a very young Catholic girl, I corresponded for years with a cloistered nun that I met at a retreat. By the time I entered high school, this lovely woman died, and I switched my allegiance to the anti-war contingent of the Catholic Church. And as the time went on, found liberation theology the only compelling narrative presented by the Catholic Church. Many
Yeah.
of the issues I discussed with the beautiful woman as a very young girl, concerns had about poverty and injustice.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, all right. And then
And the
Babs says,
Catholic Church turned away from that.
Right, yeah. But I mean, it is a difficult one for the church. I mean, they can't they can't really get themselves actively involved in politics. I mean, because then it is they do want to separate the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. They have to adhere to that Jesus said that. So it's very difficult for the church to get actively involved in political conflicts, because then the church will become
Well,
a direct
and
target of the state.
of course, but the counterpoint to that is taking to heart the scriptures. The weakest and the most oppressed. Okay,
Right.
and that is the mission of the church, because
Right.
everyone should be able to achieve salvation. Okay. And
Right.
the
Right. Right.
weakest and meekest of us all have the hardest time doing it. George is absolutely spot on correct. Okay, because we know in Latin America that the priests that were active like that ended up dead.
Yeah, that exactly. That's
Dead.
exactly what happened. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. They were dead, absolutely dead, executed. And in a particularly brutal
Yes.
fashion. I mean, it's funny now we talk about El Salvador with this president, and some of us, of us older generation, remember El Salvador, what it was like in the 1980s, the brutal civil war. And there they just executed, I think it was 6 priests. They were
And
just simply
nuns.
executed, and nuns were
Nuns.
executed. And um, and and then of course there was also Archbishop Romero. It was also El Salvador, and he was Archbishop, and he was absolutely just shot dead in the middle of
In
his
broad daylight.
service.
In broad
What?
daylight.
In broad daylight, yeah. So that was El Salvador back then. So yeah, I mean, you get involved in politics, you're going to pay a heavy price. So
But not if you get involved in politics with a different group of people like NATO land and
right,
and the Western power. See, they do get involved in politics, okay, but in a different way, okay,
right,
because that's supporting elites, okay,
right,
that are not
right.
necessarily Catholic, and probably even hate the Catholic Church, okay.
That's right. It's very funny because, of course, the when that happened in El Salvador, you think that would be a huge embarrassment for the United States, and in a way it was. But this was really when Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote their famous book, which was Manufacturing Consent. They compared, well, how does the New York Times cover the murder of Archbishop Romero with how does it cover with the disappearance of Father Popuszko in Poland? And it says, I think it's something like 10 times, 10 to 1 in terms of news coverage, newspaper coverage, ink. In those days, you still had ink, was devoted to Father Popuszko
I
to
met
Archbishop
Papiushko.
Romero.
I met Papiushko as well when I lived in
Right.
Poland.
That's right. And but the strange thing was that hey, they actually caught the guys who killed him, and they put him on trial. They imprisoned them. In the case of Archbishop Romero, they never caught the killers. So, but nonetheless, the New
Mistakes
York Times
were made. Mistakes were
mistakes were made. That's right. Um, let's see. Our friend Mark's 2023 is talking about China. Fortunately, we didn't really get round to discussing China today. So, but anyway, Marx, thank you for your comments and thank you for your contribution. We'll talk about China. We don't have there's no agreement there. I mean, I've already said my thing on China. I think China is in a very vulnerable spot. It's going to be very difficult for them to win
okay.
this.
I'm a
trade war.
contrarian on that one, so that's
I know, but that's
it'll
my
be a good
that's my take.
conversation.
Yeah, we had
All right, are we
disagreement.
almost out of time? I don't want to go
We're almost
black.
out of time. So thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you for your generous contributions. And, with a good discussion. We will see. We'll see, I think, maybe by next Monday, when we have our next live stream, who exactly is in as the front runner to take over as Pope. Um, it's really kind of interesting, when you have this conclave of cardinals and they make that decision. That's everything. It gives you a real sense of the sort of the majesty of the Catholic Church. This very secretive meeting, and So who knows what goes on there? Anyway, thank you, everybody. We will be back. See you next week. All the best. Bye-bye.